Friends, in these 100 days, the entire starting island will be completely transformed, and I'm really excited to see if you like it. So I hope you enjoy the 700 days. Friends of the sun, welcome to the next 100 days. The half-finished town didn't have any real residents yet, so the first thing I did on 601 day was build a railway line to the village. I then transported 1 or 2 villagers over, and then lured them into their new home with the beds. So every building on the island got its own resident, which was supposed to liven up the city a little. I then dismantled the railway line again, and when I observed my previous islands, I realized that I hadn't built anything from the end yet, so I wanted to change that as quickly as possible. So I flew to the end islands and looked for an end ship, which I found after a while. I wanted to completely dismantle it, and after I got the elytra, I built a small area underneath and dismantled the entire end ship, until every single block of it was dismantled, and I had thought that an end ship like this would consist of more blocks, but that was fine with me. When I got back home, I chose a suitable place and then started to rebuild the entire final ship, layer by layer. When I was finished, I placed 2 Schalke oxen, where they are usually always found in the end, and of course the elytra, and the final ship was ready. So I think that's really, really nice. The only mob I had currently built was the sheep, but after over 600 days in total, I still didn't have a mob pot collection, so I really wanted to tackle that next. To do this, I first had to build a farm, and so I took care of the building materials directly, which included melting a lot of glass and looting my kelp supply. I then chose a suitable place for it, and on 607-day construction could begin. The farm itself is actually relatively simple. The mobs spawn at the bottom, increasingly creepers of course, which are then transported up with the water elevator, and at the top, I can then turn the creepers into charged creepers. But of course, only when there is a thunderstorm. The next thing I've wanted to do for a long time was to create a map of my world, because it was already full of buildings. The card was then just randomly lying on the ground. Which brings us to today's sponsor of the video. For those unfamiliar, Genshin Impact is an open-world adventure game with 7 unique regions, with the new update bringing the latest map font. The world is so big that it stretches across approximately 6,000 football fields, which is really huge, and where you can climb, swim, and glide your way through the incredibly beautiful world. The best thing about the new update, in my opinion, is the new region, namely Fontaine. It really has a beautiful landscape and a really great panorama. So the new version is the perfect opportunity for new players to get started. Of course, new characters have also been added, including Lunette with 4 stars, who is a more reserved character and free Olay, and her big brother Lune, who is a great magician in the region and a 5-star character. To get started, I would recommend Zhongli, which is really very popular and helpful, especially for the beginning. Of course, there is also a new storyline, and new weapons and artifacts have also been added. Now, with the new update, there is also a mechanism where you can fight underwater battles without the traditional elements. Download the game now via the link in the description or simply scan the QR code. Thank you, Genshin Impact. Now let's continue with the video. I then crafted enough compasses with which I then crafted the cards and activated them one after the other. And some things look really funny on the menu. The cards were already activated, but I didn't yet have a place where I could put the big card. So I had to build a suitable place for it, for which I had to farm a little stone. Then I decided to build another island for it. And so I went next to the lighthouse and started building the map island. When I finished it, I was actually quite happy. Nothing too exciting, but nice nonetheless. So that the cards are well lit throughout, I added a glowstone layer underneath and made the individual cards a uniform size. Unfortunately, I was still missing the edges, so I crafted a few more empty cards, which I then activated all around, although almost all of them were just gray. Then I finished it, and I have to say, it looks pretty cool, but somehow I wanted to improve the entire map a bit by rendering it. I thought this should give a cool effect, so I crafted white concrete powder and had the duper farm it for 10 minutes. Then I made it the normal concrete on my concrete onverter, and when the pickaxe was about to break, I flew not to my XP old arm, but to the wither skeletal arm to get additional coal there for my super smelter, because fuel was becoming very scarce again. Then I farmed the rest of the concrete and built myself all the way to the edge of the outermost map. There, I decided to build a 4-block wide white platform, because I think it looks really cool on the map. and so the building of the white border could begin. After about half an hour, I ran out of blocks, and it was time to see what it looked like on the cards. And I really liked it quite a bit, so I really wanted to complete it. And so I tore up the duper for another quarter of an hour, and then stood at the converter for another 20 minutes. Then the bordering of the map could continue, although the phantoms continued to annoy me afterwards. Unfortunately, there was still not enough for the entire map, and so the whole thing started again from the beginning. Chill out for a bit, then stand by the converter for a bit, take a quick detour to the gold P arm, and after further converter action, finish building the white path. So now I was finished, and of course I had to look at the end result. So I updated the maps, and the final product is actually pretty nice, I have to say. But I wasn't completely satisfied yet. I wanted to embellish it a little further. Another layer on the edge was needed to improve the transition a bit, and so I decided on light gray concrete. So I had to do the same thing again, only this time with light gray concrete. Now, I was a little more experienced in this area, and building the second layer went a little faster. I got pretty far in the first round, but I still had a little to go. That meant farming and building everything again, although I narrowly missed the end in the second round. Now, all that was promised was really the last time, and on 635, I finally finished that day. I think the end result is really, really cool. It was way too much effort for such a small detail, but I definitely don't regret it. Since the phantoms were extremely annoying, I came up with a good idea. I could place cats anywhere that would scare the phantoms away. So I built a few platforms in the air where the cats could get everywhere so that not a single phantom could annoy me anymore. At least in the middle of my world. Once I was done with that, I built a railway line up and transported the first cat I had to her place. Of course, one cat wasn't enough. I needed a few more, so I decided to build a cat farm, where before I didn't even know such a thing even existed. Well, I had some sand farmed, which I then turned into sandstone and used to build the platform. Unfortunately, I didn't have enough, and so I had to farm some sand again, but then finished building the platform. For this farm, I would also need a rabbit, but unfortunately, I didn't have one, and therefore had to dismantle the one block a bit. After a while, I finally got one, and I initially wanted to put the first one next to the foxes, but I had completely forgotten that they don't get along too well. But luckily, I had a second one. I renamed this specifically and put it in a minecart. Then I had to build the whole minecart route, and when half of it was finished and I wanted to go back to the rabbit, I was surprised with this. Yes, that wasn't so nice. Well, I finished building the railway line and tackled the one block again. It took about a quarter of an hour until I had the next rabbit. But I really couldn't lose him anymore, and so I took him straight to the cat farm. Lastly, there were 5 villagers to bring over, and when they all arrived in their new homes, all I had to do was build a small sanctuary for the cats, and the farm was ready. Now it was time to test the farm, and after a short time, the first cat spawned. Unfortunately, that one spawned again a little later, but I tamed the next 2 straight away and then transported them to the spawn. But the first one just disappeared when I destroyed the Minecraft, and I was completely confused. Well, I just brought the other cat into the enclosure, and then went back to the farm, where I waited quite a long time for 2 more, which I then brought back to the spawn. And then I just noticed that the cat from before had disappeared, had simply reappeared. So, I brought everyone into their new habitat and stood by the farm again until 2 cats spawned, brought them to spawn again, and now I had a total of 7 cats. But I wanted to have a total of 9 for now, and so the game continued one last time until I had equipped the core of my island with cats. The next thing I realized was that I didn't have a proper trident for the mob head arm, just in case. So I whipped up my half-good one. And when I wanted to kill a slime with it, I remembered that I had made the best trident in the last 100 days anyway, and I had just completely overlooked it earlier. Well, now I just had 2. Then I quickly collected all the farm produce, including for the first time the cacti at the cactus arm, where a lot of people have already gathered. Next, I wanted to get back to my city and build another house. To do this, I stood at the stone farm for a moment and then started building the floor plan. Then finally, a thunderstorm started. I left everything and flew to the Mobhead Drive, where I discovered that the creepers in the water can't become charge reapers. And so I had to improvise a bit. But then I got the first mob victim from the farm and then the second one a short time later. During my next maneuver, I destroyed the farm a little, and so at the end of the storm, I only managed to farm a total of 1 mob victim of each type. A skeleton, a zombie, and a creeper victim. But now I was ready to build the house. When I was finished, I was actually quite satisfied, but the interior design was still missing, which I of course tackled straight away. I built something more modern here and there and placed my 3 mob heads that would make up the house. I built it a little differently than usual, but I think the interior design was successful. And then, of course, I worked on the floor around the outside. Overall, I think the rest of the house is pretty cool, and I can now present it to you. I didn't want to fill the last corner area with another house, but rather create a beautiful flower meadow. So I first planned the floor plan and then placed all the big pink flowers. The final product looked like this, and it looks okay, but I think I'll improve it at some point. I looked at my main island, and if we're honest, it was extremely ugly. So I wanted to change that, and not just a little, but I wanted to do something really cool and elaborate. First up was the drop chamber, which I thought at the time would be used a little more. Well, I took all the loot, had it sorted, and then dismantled the long tunnel. Next up was the whole spawn, which I completely dismantled and built a new circle parallel to it, where I also had to move all the boxes with items away. Finally, I built borders for such small towers so that I could imagine everything a little better. Now it was time to build the first tower and experiment a bit to see how it looked best. In the end, it came out, and overall, it looked pretty good. But I didn't have nearly enough blackstone for the next 7 towers, so I quickly went into the nether and farmed 1 or 2 stacks. More specifically, 34 back home, I briefly stood at the stone farm to expand the island by a block, and then started building the remaining towers, building 2 different heights to add some variety. I also added a little lighting between the corner towers. This is what it looked like at the end, which I actually liked. But I was far from finished. These shouldn't just be towers, but also candle holders. That's right, I wanted to build a circle of giant candles, so I started building the first 3. But the quartz blocks ran out relatively quickly, and so I took a short detour into the nether and farmed a lot of quartz. When I wanted to fill my shulker box again, after half an hour, I noticed that the shulker, where I had already put 13 stacks of quartz blocks, was simply no longer in my inventory, and I was a little desperate. But then I looked at the recording again and flew to exactly the spot where I apparently hadn't picked it up before. When I got there, she caught my eye straight away, and I was so happy that I found her again. Well, I continued farming for about an hour, and in the end, that was my entire yield. With all the new quartz, the building of further candles could continue. This is what it looked like in the end, which I actually really liked. But I wanted to liven up the candles with a wick and fire, for which I would need a lot of glass. So I stood at the duper for 10 minutes and had a lot of sand farmed for me. I then put that in the super smelter and melted it into glass, which I then crafted into yellow, orange, and red glass. Then on the 676th day, I started building the flames on the candles. I had some difficulties, and it took me a really long time to get the first 2 that looked reasonably good. I finished it on the 679 night, and I think it actually looks pretty cool. Next, I removed the 2 small iron farms because, firstly, they were a bit in the way, and secondly, they no longer worked anyway, since the iron golems spawned on the candles. The warehouse was completely empty again, so I sorted all the leftovers again, although the remaining warehouse was already partially full. So I had the idea of simply using one of the new candle holder towers for this. So I placed a few barrels, and all the books, tools, and pieces of armor found their new place here. Finished sorting, I wanted to continue at the spawn island on 681 day. I wanted to tackle the ground. I tried around a bit and finally decided on the pattern here. Unfortunately, I still had to farm basalt, so I went into the nether and did that for a few minutes. At the island again, building the floor could begin, although I also had to build a block under it everywhere so that I could place the basalt correctly. I finished it on the 685 day, and I actually think the pattern is pretty nice, but I don't know if everyone will like it. Next, I expanded the island by another block so that the towers weren't completely on the edge. I then decided to make the edge with obsidian. And since the island wasn't just supposed to be flat, I wanted to build something underneath it. So I went underneath and immediately started building an ellipse with obsidian. Until I ran out of obsidian, so I repaired my pickaxe, set up a full beacon in the end, and started dismantling an obsidian tower. I did this until the 691 tag, and then continued building the ellipse. I ran out of obsidian towards the end, so I found 10 minutes of obsidian again, and finished building the rest, which didn't take too long. Now that the candles were up, there was a slight change of plans for the cats. I wanted to put them right at the top of the candles so that you can't see them, but they still have their effect. So for the next while, I brought one cat after another to their new home, which was at the top of every candle. With that done, I dismantled the rest in the air so that it wouldn't get in the way so ugly. Now everything was gone again, except for cat number 9. She can chill out in the glass chamber for a bit. Next, I wanted to tackle the undeveloped edges of the new spawn island, where I first tried grass, which I didn't like, and then spleen oil blocks, which wasn't so nice either. So I decided to just continue the floor pattern here, which was a bit complicated, but definitely looked good in the end. I used the last 2 days to remove my old camp because it was really too close to the main island. It wasn't the dismantling that took so long, but rather the sorting of all the remaining items, some of which I put back in the candlestick urn. There were now books, pieces of armor, and also potions to be found in there. In the old camp, I also found an old map, which I updated and where you can now see the new main island. That gave me the idea of blocking all cards from the large card. This means that you can no longer update them. I want to see progress on this over the next few hundred days. A lot has already happened in the middle of the map. That was it. I survived 700 days in Minecraft Hardcore 1 block without dying.